There's an old saying that many are probably familiar with. It says, life is short, better enjoy it while you can. There's another saying that most of you are probably unfamiliar with. It says, eternity is long, better prepare for it while you can. Then there's another saying which I have added, and it says, time is short and many are unprepared. We need to be about our Father's business. Many of us have family and friends who are unprepared for eternity. Many have not yet made a personal commitment to Jesus, and many more think they are ready for heaven because they were christened or baptized as an infant. They don't realize that going to heaven requires a personal relationship with Jesus. These teachings are to stir us to winning our lost family and friends to Jesus before time runs out. Welcome to Making Revelation Simple. This is a continuation of the commentary on the book of Revelation. This is chapter 2. As we studied chapter 1 and got to verse 3, we discovered that there was a blessing for those who read and hear the words read, and also those who keep the words of this prophecy. And what we determined was the words of the prophecy that were to be kept, the commands that were given to the 7 churches of Laodicea. And that associates itself with both chapter 2 and chapter 3. So here today, we're going to cover chapter 2 and the letters to the churches that were found therein. The first thing we should do as we begin to look at these letters is recognize that there's a structure to each and every letter. Each letter starts with the words, unto the angel, or pastor, as we said in chapter 1. This is it could be looked at as the mailing address where we're going to send the letter. And then the next thing is John's instruction. He's told to write. And then following that, it's these things saith. And those are the words from Jesus, or actually from John's, quoting what Jesus tells him to tell these churches. And then I know thy works. This is Jesus's critique and admonition to each church. And then finally, Jesus closes with a statement to him that overcomes, to those who keep the commands and receive the promise, they get this overcomer's promise. So let's look at these letters to the churches and see just how they unfold. So here highlighted, before we go through this specific church, we're just showing the highlights in the yellow. Unto the angel, or the pastor of the church of Ephesus. There's that first salutation, which is really the address of the letter. And then it says, write. That's the command to John. And he says, these things saith, and here you see, he that holdeth the 7 stars in this case. This is a attribute of Jesus Christ that gives him the authority to critique and judge this church. And then he goes on to say, I know thy works, and he provides the critique of how he feels that church is doing spiritually and what they ought to be doing differently. And then finally, Jesus closes and says, to him that overcometh, I will give, and he gives some promise to that person. And we're going to look down now at each and every church letter and see how they each one match and follow this pattern. So there's 4 churches that are addressed here in chapter 2. They are Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, and Thyatira. There are 3 churches that are addressed in chapter 3. They are Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. And they all follow this same format and structure that we just looked at here. The mailing address, John's instruction, Jesus' proclamation, and then his critique and admonition to the church, and finally, his promise to the overcomers. As we read the messages to each of the 7 churches, keep in mind that these 7 individual letters, 4 in this chapter and 3 in the next, are all from Jesus and not from John. John is merely the recorder of the message. Therefore, the first thing we see in each letter is what could easily be mistaken for a salutation for the pastor, but it's really more like a mailing address telling us where this particular letter is to be sent to. After this, we find the command instructing John to write. We've now reached at this point the beginning of the message that Jesus has for this particular pastor and congregation. And now that we've reached the heart of the message, this first thing Jesus does is to proclaim who he is in regard to this particular church. In each letter, Jesus selects some personal attribute pertaining to his deity and authority over the pastor and the congregation that he's about to critique. Jesus then states that he knows the church's works, and he proceeds to review both the good and the bad that he sees within the church body. Jesus closes with a recommendation of how to be more faithful and obedient servant, with a promise of eternal blessing to all those who are willing to be overcomers. Jesus again declares his deity and authority over or through the promise he makes to each individual church pastor and congregation. This is a promise that only Jesus, being the Son of God, can make and keep. Every overcomer will be the beneficiary of the promises made to each church. So let's review these churches here. So we had Ephesus. It was the apostolic church, and these time frames kind of override, but they're representative, I believe, of 7 time periods through the church age. Ephesus being the church, and then Smyrna and Pergamum and Thyatira and Tyrus and Philadelphia and Laodicea. And it's important to keep in mind that there were not just 7 churches in Asia at this point in time when these letters were written. There were many, many churches there, but Jesus selected just these 7. The apostolic church, that was the favored church, the initial church where they were on fire for God. Then you have the Ephesus church. That's the desirable church. And desirable is a term that was very similar to, think of it in terms of a bridegroom, and he's got this bride that he's about to marry. She's very desirable to him. That's how Jesus felt about the Ephesus church. And I love how the meaning of the names of these churches correlate to the description of the church. The Smyrna church, it means myrrh, and we think of frankincense and myrrh. This myrrh is a fragrance, an ointment that was used in preparing the body for burial and preserving it, and how appropriate to be used here for the church of Smyrna, because that was considered to be the martyrdom church. These people were being martyred for their faith, and Smyrna means myrrh. And then the next church, as we come down through the history, was Pergamum, the compromising church. And then when we go down, we look the meaning of Pergamum, it means marriage or elevation. And what's actually happening there is the church is opening themselves up and inviting the world into the church. They're compromising their standards and their faith in order to add people in that really shouldn't be there without really giving their hearts and lives to God. Then as you move on to Thyatira, that's the Roman Catholic Church. It was the one that was in strength and power at that point in time, and that stands for continual sacrifice. And then following it is the Sardis Church. That's the Reformation Church. That's the one that Martin Luther and John Calvin kind of began to start. They pulled away from the Roman Catholic Church and started the Protestant Church. And it means a remnant, this little small group that really started fighting back and trying to pull back closer to God. And then following that, you had the Philadelphia church. That was the revival church. That's the one that had the least amount of condemnation from Jesus. He really liked this church. And it's known as the church of brotherly love. And then finally, we get down to the Laodicean church. That's the church of our time today. And it was the most worldly church. And I thought it was amazing when I discovered that Laodicean meant the rights of the people, and how often we hear that in our society today. Oh, I've got rights. You can't do that. Or you got to recognize my rights here. It's all about me and not about Jesus. This was the worldly church. So again, keep in mind as we go on and continue our study that these 7 churches all existed in the same time frame back in John's day, even though they represented, I believe, the 7 time periods of the church age. And likewise, I believe you can go out somewhere and find churches that are representative of all 7 of these types in our day to day, even though the predominant church that you're going to find in our church age today is the Laodicean church. But I'm sure there's some small little pockets of Ephesus churches out there, the one that Jesus really loved initially. So let's move forward and look at the individual church letters now. It says, to the church of Ephesus, unto the angel or pastor of the church, write, these things saith he that holds the stars in his hand. This is who Jesus is to this church. He holds these stars, the pastors, in his hand. in the midst of the golden candlesticks, which are the churches. And he says, I know thy works, and I have somewhat against thee. This is what you ought to do. You need to repent. And to him that overcometh, I will give to eat of the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God. That's the promise to the overcomer. So this was the church of Ephesus. To the church of Smyrna, unto the angel in the church of Smyrna write, these things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. That's who he is to this church. They're being martyred, and he's telling them he was dead, and now he is alive. I know your works, your tribulation, your poverty. They think they're poor, but he's saying you're really rich. I know the blasphemy of them that say they are Jews, but aren't. And he says, to him that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. They were highly concerned with death because they were being put to death for their faith in Jesus. The church of Pergamos, again, unto the angel of the church of Pergamos, and John's told to write, these things saith he that hath a sharp two-edged sword. I know thy works. And then I have a few things against thee. Here's his analysis of how this church is doing. And then he says, to him that overcometh, I will give to eat of the hidden manna, and will give him a white stone and a new name. Again, there is the promise to the overcomer. And to the church of Thyatira, again, unto the angel of the church of Thyatira, write John's command. These things saith the Son of God, who hath his eyes like a flame of fire, and his feet like fine brass. Again, that's who he is to this church. I know thy works, your charity, and your service, but I have a few things against thee. And again, he says, to him that overcometh and keepeth my works, to him I will give power over the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. As the vessels of the potter shall they be broken to shivers, and I will give him the morning star. Again, these are the promises to the overcomer. These are the churches listed in chapter 2, and that completes our commentary on chapter 2. Next is our commentary on chapter 3.